in a republic where the citizens continue to drive power up as things have happened. And so there's a lot of different options. The biggest thing is just like with Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas was where they banded together and started moving forward. 5 states have now passed legislation in various forms to start studying this issue in different forms. Let's look at this question. Let's look at our rights. Let's look at these obligations. Let's look at solutions. And let's look at how we're going to be pioneers of the future instead of prison guards of the past. Because the status quo, as your governor pointed out so well, is not going to work. And we all know. If we keep doing what we're doing over and over again, expecting different results, the environmental degradation is going to be devastating for generations. The economic devastation is going to be horrendous, where 42% of our state budget comes from a federal government that's broke. Status quo is just not an option. Or at least it's not an option that's going to work for anybody. Even the ones who want to care for the environment, the ones who want to care just for the economy, but more particularly those that want to get to and say we think we can do both, like your governor talked about. It's not an option for any of those groups. You got the ones that say just this, and you got the other ones that say just this. No, it's an and proposition. But doing nothing doesn't work for any of those groups. So that's where we go. So we passed that bill. This is the Federalist Society legal analysis. They did a full legal analysis of what we're doing. They've concluded, and they go through the same history, and they put a lot more law into it. Legally, historically, constitutionally focused. There's another legal analysis that just came out this week by a constitutional scholar. Happy to send that to you. That's a little 5-page summary. We can send that to you as well. But if you'll get on the mailing list or text here, we'll send this stuff to you. So why does it matter? I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but out of your $7 billion in annual revenue, 41.6% comes from a federal government that is fiscally suicidal right now, unfortunately, from both parties. It's not a Republican or Democrat issue. For 5 years, they haven't had a budget. That's the number one constitutional function of Congress. They haven't had a budget for 5 years. Here's a quiz for you. We'll see who's ready for this morning. First 6 weeks of this fiscal year, right? The U.S. fiscal year starts October 1. First 6 weeks of this fiscal year, how much did we overspend as a nation in 6 weeks? Any guess?
I'll guess $1 billion.
$1 billion. That'd be about a couple minutes.
Trillion.
$1 trillion in 6 weeks. In 6 weeks. Put that in perspective. You know how long it would take to count to a trillion, just to count to 1 trillion? It'd take about 32,000 years to count to a trillion. We overspent that much in 6 weeks. We added that to the debt. And tragically, so this is the trajectory on the debt. We've blown so fast. I can't keep this chart. Honestly, I can't keep this chart up to date fast enough. We've already blown clear through the top of that. We're already up to 18 trillion now with the trillion that was just added. And to think that somehow we can ignore that. Any of you do any farming? You got equipment. You get a little issue in your equipment. You say, if I just ignore that long enough, it'll probably work out all right for me. That's what we're doing. The deficit, the overspend is $1 trillion a year. Now it's trillions more than that. But when you count the promises, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that there's no money for, the actual accrual basis of the deficit's more than $5 trillion a year. Those are the promises that we're making that there's no money for. 10,000 baby boomers a day retiring, wanting that promise to be kept. There's no money sitting there. And this is how we're purporting to solve the problem. It's been tried hundreds of times in various forms of devaluing the money, printing, monetization. It's been tried hundreds of times throughout history. Not one has ever succeeded. And yet that's our plan. And 42% of your revenue in Montana, 45% of our revenue in Utah comes from the federal government that's operating its finances in that condition. Every year in its consolidated financial statement, it tells us that it's unsustainable. Right in the financial statement, it says this is unsustainable, which by definition means it's going to end. So imagine in your company, right? In your companies, you say, 45%, 42% of our revenue comes from one source that is already bouncing checks to the payday loan company, and you recommend to your board, let's just keep doing what we're doing. What could go wrong with that? At the end of the day, commissioners, we've got to educate the children in our communities. We've got to take care of sick people and poor people and roads and public safety, no matter what happens in Washington, on the left or the right or whatever's going on there. We've got to take care of our community. And so this is serious. It's serious. Erskine Bowles, if we had time, I'd show you a video. Erskine Bowles is Clinton White House Chief of Staff. He said, we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. 2 years ago, he said it may be 2 years, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. He said, but we're there. And so, you know, to think that we're just going to keep eating the seed corn and that's going to be a good economic policy, it's never worked before. This is Rob Bishop talking about the issue a little bit.
I want you to look carefully at this map. See where the red is, and then I also want you to look at this particular map. States in red are the states that have the hardest time funding their education system. That is the slowest growth in education. I hope you realize there is a similarity between the two particular maps, because the bottom line is individuals in the West pay more in state and federal taxes than in the East. There are more kids in the West. We have larger class sizes in the West. Our education system has a harder time to fund itself in the West because this map prohibits us from developing our property taxes, developing our energy royalties, developing high-paying jobs with income taxes, so kids are hurt in the West. I'm sorry, this map and this situation means that kids are underfunded. Can I get 50 seconds?
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
Kids in the West, their education is underfunded, their teachers' salaries are depressed, and my retirement is threatened because of this particular situation.
When he talks about his retirement, Congressman Bishop is a former high school history teacher. And so he's in that same state system. And you'll notice North Dakota was on that map. They're not red anymore. They're so far from being red with what they're able to do. Idaho was yellow. They dispute that. They said they had some one-time anomaly. They're as red as anybody else. But you know, it's just natural where it is. This environmentally, the top map is wildfires more than 250 acres, and the bottom map. You know, even when you look over on the east, you know, the Tennessee Valley Authority, concentration of fires. Florida, concentration of fires. You know all of these. I mean, we're killing millions of animals in these fires. After the fires come the floods because there's no ground cover. They devastate the watershed for decades. Air quality issues, you know about that all too well. Senator Fielder pointed this out. This came from the USDA and the Forest Service. Tens of thousands of miles of transmission lines, not just power lines, but transmission lines, at severe risk because of the tinderbox conditions. You know, the people say, well, we can't afford to manage our own land. Well, $18 trillion in debt, overspending $1 trillion in 6 weeks. And we'll talk about some of the issues on revenue. Quite honestly, we can't afford not to. This comes from the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, just last year. This has gone out to state foresters and others. They captured documents from Al-Qaeda, and including in the Inspire magazine, because of course if you had a terrorist magazine, that's probably what you would call it, right? In their Inspire magazine, they encourage the use of wildfire as a form of jihad. It's happening right now. They understand the tinderbox conditions, and for hundreds of dollars, they can do billions of dollars of intergenerational damage right now. I mean, again, it just kind of goes back to what your governor said. This is an urgent, extreme emergency situation. Oh, let me
the community of Wrangell, where I went to.
This is Senator Lisa Murkowski. You know, now based on what we've talked about from 1780 to 1976, think about that as she describes this situation quite effectively.
The community of Wrangell, where I went to elementary.
Oh, okay, now I've got somebody after me here.
The community of Wrangell, where I went to elementary school, is a community where 64% of their budget for the school comes from Secure Rural Schools funding. When they don't know where 64% of their budget is going to be coming from on a year-to-year basis, it causes a great deal of stress. The PILT program, of course, is permanent, so we're not concerned about the program expiring, but what we are concerned about is the level at which the program is funded. PILT was created in 1976 by Congress because we changed our federal land policy from one that was focused on disposal to one that was focused on retention. These payments are literally payments in lieu of taxes to compensate our local governments for the loss in tax revenue caused by this change in policy. Secure Rural Schools, unlike PILT, was largely a replacement program for the receipt sharing programs, whether it's the Forest Service payments to states and the Bureau of Management that Oregon and California have for their payments. These payments made under these programs were historically from receipts generated by timber sales for roads and school purposes. But I think we recognize that they were never intended to be a permanent entitlement program, but more specifically a temporary short-term bridge to allow the communities to transition to the new economic reality that was forced upon them by environmental policies that were designed to halt timber harvesting. But if you're a community like Ketchikan, where I was born down in southeast Alaska, Ketchikan, their private taxable lands within the Ketchikan Gateway Borough are 0.3%. 0.3%. So if you have no other place to go, if 96.5% of the land in your borough is held by the federal government, the state has 1.3%, the local government has 0.3%, there is 0.3% that is taxable land. So when you say you've got this federal policy that says you can't harvest within the Tongass because we're just saying you can't harvest in the Tongass, and you have no place to go for your tax base, and we say, well, this is just going to be a temporary program for you until you can transition. The question is, what do you transition to? But I think we all know, I mean, we're having budget conversations this week. It's on everybody's mind. Federal government's broke here. We can't continue to pay counties to not utilize the lands within their boundaries. And Mr. Chairman, you have appropriately suggested where we need to go with this. You need to be able to access the resources that are on your lands. We either need to utilize our federal lands to generate the revenue and the jobs for our rural communities, or we should divest the federal government of those lands and let the states or the counties, the boroughs manage them.
There's a lot we could talk about just from that, but you see, same thing, right? We changed our policy. Well, they didn't change the policy. They changed the Solemn Compact and the Constitution and the Enabling Acts and all the court opinions that talked about that as being a trust, and then said, we'll just welcome to the new economic reality. We're going to take all the resources away, and you'll just find some new economic reality, and we're going to pay you the 13 cents on a dollar, to the payment in lieu of the taxes that you would have if you were governing yourself, and the 48 cents on the dollar, and the Secure Rural Schools. But now they're even taking that away. We can't afford to keep paying counties to not utilize their lands. Right? She says, we have no place else to go. There's no place else to go, but she's very correct in that. Now, this is what's happening already. So a couple of weeks after she made that statement, sequestration went into effect. Right? Sequestration was where the federal government, Republicans and Democrats, couldn't create a budget, and certainly couldn't balance a budget. In Washington, there's just some pathological inability to only spend what you make. And because they couldn't do that, and they couldn't even agree to how to get there, they passed a bill that said, if we can't agree by this date, they're going to be automatic cuts. And that's called sequestration. Well, those automatic cuts are coming right out of Title I schools. The automatic cuts now, the revenues, the 13 cents on a dollar that the commissioner here was going to take to as payment in lieu of taxes, that's being cut right now, this year. That's your revenue. Under the guise of cutting federal expense, they're cutting your revenue. Remember the Solemn Compact, it's only a trust, you're supposed to be able to tax the land and govern yourself, and they give you a payment in lieu of that, and now that's even being cut. Secure Rural Schools, they're not only cutting that going forward, they're reaching back in time saying you have to pay back what was already spent. That's happening right now. It's not if or when that 42% of the revenue that comes into our state goes away. It's happening right now because of all the federal financial situations. This is what, unfortunately, political management of public land looks like. In Utah, we have an $8 billion tourism industry built up around our national parks. We had a rich resource industry, and that was shut down, and we developed a vibrant tourism industry. From one day to the next, families were on the street, literally. From one day to the next, tourists from around the world who had, their life savings, their once-in-a-lifetime trip, are in tears, saying, what do I do now? They're never coming back. From one day to the next, the counties that have 3% taxable land are dark. That's unfortunately what political management looks like. Instead of those whose lives and livelihoods depend upon the land, who are more responsive and responsible, governing themselves, this is what political management looks like. This has happened earlier this year. China is now compelling South American countries to auction off hundreds of thousands of acres of land and all the natural resources to satisfy debt obligations to China. Thank heavens we don't owe any money to China, right? China is accumulating resources all around the world. Have we pledged land to China? I don't know. I don't want to find out.
They're buying it.
Yeah, they're buying it. I mean, they're acquiring resources, real stuff, while we're printing money, creating money out of thin air. They're acquiring real stuff. I want to make sure that we've asserted our rights under this trust situation before that federal government, thinking that it has the rights unlimited to do whatever it wants, does whatever it may do. I don't want to find out the answer to that question. This is earlier this year, Institute for Energy Research, $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the federally controlled lands. 9 times our national debt locked up. There are solutions big enough. The Government Accountability Office last year testifying to Congress, this is the chief auditor for the United States government, testifying to Congress that there's more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming alone than the rest of the world combined, locked up in federally controlled lands. There are solutions big enough. 5 states have now passed legislation to begin looking at the logistics of solutions moving forward, being pioneers of the future and not prison guards of the past. We know status quo doesn't work. Nevada is one of them. They had some studies done. They looked at public lands. States manage millions of acres of public lands already. Some people say, oh, you can't manage the land. States are already managing millions of acres of public land. Their study looked at public land managed by states throughout the West, States generate net positive revenue on average of $6.29 per acre managing public land. Federal government, on the other hand, loses $1.86. Now this study was done in 1996. They're now bringing that current. They anticipate that gap's going to be even wider now, given where the policies have gone over the last 15 years. This is just Oregon. On the federal side, the expenses far exceed the revenues. On the state side, the revenues exceed the expenses. I went to law school instead of business school, but I understand that, generally revenues are supposed to exceed expenses. On the state, it does. Washington is only 1,283 times more effective at revenue per acre than the U.S. Forest Service. It's not the people on the ground. I think the people on the ground are very well-intentioned and care about the land, but the policies that come from above tie their hands in 100 different ways. Idaho's only 917 times more effective. In Montana, you got to pick up the pace. You're only 178 times more effective than the Forest Service in generating revenue per acre on Forest Service land. So we talked about Thomas Hart Benton, how knowledge and courage, and in a republic when we raise up these leaders, and this one man changed a number of states from being 90% federally controlled for decades to having them keep the same promise. One man. Think of the opportunity if he had had a Facebook page or a YouTube channel or Twitter, right? Email, airplanes. And yet one man did that. The opportunity to educate, to share knowledge. Let me just share with you a little story that goes along with this. My ancestors came to Utah, and some of them came like that, pulling a handcart to get there, across Wyoming, across the desert to get there, so that they could get their children to a place that they felt like they would have liberty and property and the ability to govern themselves. It was why they were going there. Along the way, this was their ration of food for a day. It was an 8-ounce pouch of flour. That was all they got for a day to eat. And they would tie it on their belt as they went across. And what they found as they were going across, some of the biggest and strongest of their men were dropping along the trail side. And they were very distressed by that. And they were trying to figure out, well, what's happening with our men as they're dropping along the trail. And as they started to look and find out what was going on, the men were taking from their flour and scooping it into the pouches for their children, so that they would be sure that they would make it to where they were going. Pilgrims told the same story. The Pilgrims said, if we can just get to that land of freedom and plant our faces in the mud, that our children can walk over our backs to liberty and freedom and property and the ability to govern themselves. That was their sole focus. It seems as if we're eating the seed corn and we're going the other way and taking it out. To think that we can perpetually print prosperity defies common sense, it defies history. And so we have a choice. I didn't come here to tell you any pleasant stories or give you some easy solution, but to give you information and burden you, if you will. There are solutions, there are opportunities going forward. This is a prominent leader from Utah. He says, of course we're going to face fear and experience ridicule and meet opposition, but let us have the courage to defy the consensus. The courage to stand for principle, like property and liberty and self-governance. Courage, not compromise, brings the smile of God's approval. A moral coward is one who is afraid to do what he thinks is right because others will disapprove or laugh. But remember that all men have their fears, but those who face their fears with dignity have courage as well. Martin Luther King put it this way. He says, the soft-minded man always fears change. He feels security in the status quo and has an almost morbid fear of the new. For him, the greatest pain is the pain of a new idea. Well, I would suggest that the new idea is an opportunity to battle for, not against anyone or anything, but to battle for a solution that is big enough to fund education and care for the environment, to grow the economy and prevent the loss of watershed, to attain energy independence and prevent the loss of millions of acres of habitat and wildlife. As your governor pointed out, in the states, divergent interests come together, they work out solutions. Washington's not interested in solutions. But we have no choice in terms of where we go. I mean, we can continue to sit back and hope for the best and do the same things over and over again, or we act. And this is what's happening. If we fail on this, it's not because it's illegal or impossible or unconstitutional. As you know, people like to throw out sound bites. Oh, that's unconstitutional. Well, why? Well, it's illegal. Well, why? Well, it's impossible. Well, why? It's already been done. It'll be because we lack the knowledge and the courage. And we in a republic and our leaders and us, we lack the knowledge and the courage because it's already been done. So what can we do? As counties, this organization was founded by counties originally. We passed our bill and about 5 different counties from a number of western states came and said, Representative Ivory, you're going on offense. We've been playing defense for 40 years. We're losing ground every day. We need to go on offense jurisdictionally and assert these rights. So it was a number of counties that formed the American Lands Council. I think we have about 38 counties on board now. We'd love to have you join with us to help move this message forward. Counties are joining somewhere in the neighborhood of I think most of them are about $5,000, but others are putting in whatever they can. Some are joining with $25,000 to help move this message forward. Know and share. What we're doing, we're retooling the website now so that you'll be able to just one-click sign a petition, one-click pass resolutions and send them on to your counties and school boards and chambers of commerce, one-click send letters and do that sort of thing. Knowledge and courage. I would suggest that I'm going home, all right? So I'm done here. You've got a wonderful senator and representatives and commissioners. And whatever you do is going to be what happens in Montana. In other states, they're forming committees. They're forming transfer of public lands, official and unofficial task forces to begin to continue to develop the information and disseminate the information. What we're going to have on the website is a little know and share tab, so you can just go in and take some of these slides and images and have little one-click things, and you can just automatically send those on and study more. But then I would also submit something really cool is happening in Utah right now. We unfortunately had our Attorney General resigned, and we're picking a new Attorney General now. In the process of picking the Attorney General, imagine what's happening. The State Central Committee are in charge of sending 3 names to the governor. Every candidate is getting asked questions like this. Why the difference? Promises are the same. Why the difference? What are you going to do about it? Who else can you bring to this effort, and how can we help you? Think of the power in that job interview of these candidates now from those who are their bosses, who are hiring them, that they're now asking them, this is critically important. Do you know there's $150 trillion in mineral value locked up? Do you know there's more recoverable oil than the rest of the world combined? Do you know, like your governor said, this is an environmental emergency right now? What are you going to do about this, because the promises are the same? Think of how that's driving these candidates the opportunity to educate next year as we have elections at the local, state, and national level. So we have this kind of campaign project where you'll have these kind of job interview questions on the website, and for candidates, talking points to walk through these simple talking points on, these are the basic fundamental principles and rights. This is what a lot of communities are doing now. Resolutions, counties have passed resolutions, farm bureaus, chambers of commerce, school boards, passing resolutions. This one comes from about 6 different cities and 4 or 5 chambers of commerce. We urge the continued petition of the federal government to honor Utah's compact of statehood as they did with eastern states by disposing of the public lands. The success enjoyed by other states in securing control of their lands was the product of a united front and an unequivocal determination to reject no as an answer. The eastern states succeeded in compelling Congress to transfer title of the public lands. So should we. This is coming from all over in different states where they're passing resolutions, sending them to their state representatives, governors, state elected officials, members of Congress, to start building that knowledge and courage in a republic from the base up. This is really kind of cool. South Carolina this year. South Carolina passed a resolution supporting the transfer of public lands to the western states. Why would they do that? Well, they're spending tens of billions of dollars now to subsidize us to not use our own resources to educate our own kids and care for our own communities. Also, they understand that with $150 trillion in mineral value locked up, the heavy equipment is going to come from all over the nation. The IT and the financing and the other services are going to come from all over the nation in developing that resource and protecting the environment. They understand that. They understand that that's the only solution big enough to begin to deal with a $1 trillion a year deficit and begin to move a direction that's productive. We've got states all over the East now that we're working with. We'll probably see a great number more resolutions coming from eastern states, them owning the problem as their problem, as a national problem, not just a Western problem. And so that's very exciting. That's all been happening, you guys, that's all been happening in about a year and a half. I mean, basically with no budget and just grit and people moving forward. That's happened in a year and a half. 5 states have passed legislation, eastern states moving, national dialogue. Imagine if we started getting some more resource and manpower putting into this, and that's where it goes. So let's go back to where we started, right? Does it matter? Well, the promises are the same. Federal government promised from 1780 forward it would dispose of those lands. It only held them for 2 purposes in trust. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt. Promises are the same. It's already been done repeatedly, even recently with Hawaii. It's the only solution big enough to fund education, better care for the environment, grow the economy locally and nationally, and attain some level of energy independence. And so we got a choice. We know the status quo doesn't work for many, many, many areas. We can be pioneers of the future, or we can be prison guards of the past. And with that, this is just a little 3-minute overview video, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. Some people say this movement for the transfer of our public lands is just about selling them off to rich fat cats, or that we can't afford to manage our own lands. The funny thing is, the only people making these arguments are the ones who want to continue to increase federal control over our lands. This is about a failed federal lands policy that is killing Western communities, draining money right out of our kids' education, closing off recreation and grazing access, burning up Western forests, and locking up trillions of dollars in abundant natural resources in Western communities. Don't our children deserve the same opportunities to fund education, grow their economies as children east of Colorado do? This is about the only solution big enough to actually solve these problems, not lobby or litigate for greater federal control over our lands. Have you ever seen this map before? Most people ask, why the difference? Well, that's a great question, because from the founding of our nation until 1976, Congress knew that it was obligated to transfer title to these public lands at statehood. In fact, in the statehood agreement, called an enabling act of every state, Congress reaffirmed the promise to transfer title to the public lands. So if the promise to transfer title to the public lands is the same, why the difference? In 1976, Congress came up with a policy to simply keep all these lands in federal ownership. Now, there's a lot of problems with this policy, including the fact that the Supreme Court recently said unanimously that Congress doesn't have the authority to simply change the promises at statehood, particularly where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. When Congress changed its lands policy, it promised to pay Western communities for not utilizing their lands and forests and other resources to fund education and roads and other public services. Did you know that with so much land under federal control, some communities have less than 10% taxable land? Well, guess what? The federal government is broke here, and now it's reneging on these promises to Western communities to pay them for not utilizing their lands. It's shutting off even more access for recreation and grazing, locking up literally trillions of dollars in abundant natural resources in the West. Federal forest policies prevent harvesting any trees, even when they've been killed by beetle devastation. This is causing raging wildfires, polluting the air, killing millions of animals, and devastating watershed for decades. Once Congress keeps its promise, federal public lands become state public lands, protecting access for recreation and hunting and fishing and grazing, and opening up access to our abundant natural resources to create jobs, fund education, and grow local, state, and national economies. Making Congress keep its obligation to transfer our public lands, just like it already did with Hawaii and all states east of Colorado, really is the only solution big enough. Today, some billionaire is going to write $1 million check to some extremist organization to keep you from accessing and using your Western lands. Today, those same extremist organizations are going to file lawsuit after lawsuit and then settle, creating new policy that shuts down your access and use to your Western lands. Today, some federal bureaucrat or agency is going to unroll a new policy that shuts off your access and use to your Western lands. What are you going to do today? That's available on the website, and you can share that. There's a lot of other videos. There's presentations like this that we've done in counties around the West that are on the website, on the YouTube channel, that are also broken down into segments, and so you can, they're broken down into little bite-sized bits. Why did the federal government ever control the land? What about the promises and things like that? But thank you so much for your time. It's a lot to digest, and it's certainly a big issue, and going forward with a fact-based conversation. But happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I was just curious, like you mentioned, the 532 people in Congress and some of the problems that have, like you mentioned, history, with the start when Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot decided to create the Forest Service. And at that time, it was more for public use. I mean, the Rangers and the Forest Service were stewards of the community. They assisted the loggers. They